Hey guys, today we're going to talk about these two guns, almost twins from 1945. Walther started making the model PP back in 1929. I actually have an early one I can show you from about 1930. However, Zellamella's factory made them all the way up to 1945 when the GIs came in. Patton's army was coming up from the south through Munich and came to Zellamella's, took over the factory, and there's a lot of history in these guns that were made in 1945. These two were made in 1945, just before the GIs came in, and this one when the GIs were in the factory. Let's compare and contrast the two. Okay, this is the early gun that I was talking about. You can see the difference right away. This has more of a high polished finish. It also has a fire blue safety, and the extractor is fire blued. Here you see they're just blued. This gun has early features, and I believe it is from 1929, first year of production, because it's gun number about 3600. The serial number started at 750,000, so you can see this is 753. So this is about the 3600th gun. And assuming they made probably 5,000 in the first year, 29, this was made in the first year. You can clearly see the Eagle N. That was the proof mark. Later, they put it here and here. This has some other early features, such as heavy hammer. This is considered a heavy hammer. Compared to that, you can see that the hammer is thicker. You know, the ring is smaller. Here it's wider. So this is considered a heavy hammer and a fat safety. Wonder how it gets the name fat safety. Well, of course, it's a little bit fatter. Also, 90 degrees. That was a decocker, by the way. Doesn't make the round discharge, but it decocks the gun. 90 degree versus 60 degree. Now, we've talked about before the reason they changed it is because the 90 degree would often hit the top of the grip and chip. Also, I want to study the grips a little bit. This is the earliest style grips. I can tell it's an X grip because the X grip doesn't go all the way to the top. Here you can see it goes all the way to the top. You can't really see the mechanism inside there, but here I can see the mechanism inside the gun. You can see it, mechanisms working inside underneath the grip. So this is an early X grip. Let me show you some different grips. Okay, I could do a whole video just studying grips for the PPs and PPKs, but in a nutshell, these are the X grips. Let's focus on these. The reason it gets its name is because it's got an X. Now that X was intended to be reinforcement. They may have gotten the idea from the 1911, but actually that would have been later. If you studied 1911s, they have plastic grips with a cross in it as reinforcement, and then later they go to no background at all, but we're out of sequence. This is the X grip. That was the earliest variation. Then it went to a weighted grip. So the X didn't provide enough reinforcement. So in the 1930s, they used a weighted grip. And all that is there's a piece of metal in here that is weighted. You can feel it. It's heavy, but it reinforces the grip. It causes cracking here because that piece of metal, when it gets cold, it contracts. When it gets hot, it expands. So that expansion contraction causes these. Here's a piece of the metal right here, peeking his head through. There's also a piece of metal here. You can see some rust here. So that piece of metal, that insert, and by the way, the PPK also has a piece of metal to reinforce it. It causes cracking, and you can see right here. Often these early grips will show these cracks. And there's something interesting about these cracked grips. I have some in my supply because whenever I get a gun from 1945, I check out the grip. Now the most common is these wooden grips in 1945. These are the wooden grips. I have an example to show you both sides. It's just a piece of beechwood, I believe. Light colored. In 1945, they were running out of resources, and these require a certain amount of oil, and that was in heavy demand, so they started using these wooden grips. But you know what the second most common grip for 1945? It was an early weighted grip that's cracked. Now, they stopped making these in the end of the 30s, and once the war started, they stopped reinforcing. So these are just hollowed out back. It's plastic. Bakelite. This is heavy with a metal insert. Because during the war, they were just trying to bang them out as fast as possible. They didn't care about weighting the grip, and so they skipped that step. It saved time and it saved money. So why in 1945 do we almost always see, when it's black plastic, it's a weighted cracked grip? Well, there's only one answer that makes sense to me, and I explain this to people all the time because they buy in 1945. Said, I love my 1945. The only problem is it has these early grips from the 30s, and it shouldn't be on that gun. So they swap out the grips. They said, send me a perfect set of grips, and I'll get rid of these cracked grips. I'm convinced. So here's what happened. In Germany, they're making the guns in the 1930s. They are made for commercial use. These grips become cracked, and who's going to buy a brand new gun that has a crack in the grip? So what they did is they exchanged the grips, or they took the grip off at the factory and they threw it in a bin that was marked reject. And I don't know that for a fact, but I'm making up this story and I like it. So they have this pile of grips that are called rejects, and all of them are cracked. Now we get to 1945 and we don't have the resources to make these grips anymore. We don't have the resources. So what do? I use wood, and I go back to that closet and I say, hey, bring me all those rejected grips and let's put them on these 1945 guns. So 1945, almost always, these two are 1945, they'll almost always have wooden grips, or they'll have these cracked early grip. I hope that makes sense to you. There's one other grip I want to mention. 1943, for a short period of time, they made a reddish grip. There's a Krieghoff grip that looks a lot like this. It's a reddish brown. I have no idea why they experimented with this color in 1943. It seems to me they would have better things to do with their time, but they tried these red grips, and these are highly sought after because they only made them for a short period of time. In 1943, you'll see a block of guns in like the 330 to 350 range that may or may not have these red grips. Now, let's talk about these two 1945 guns. First of all, they're AC marked. You won't see a logo. Notice there's no logo. Here and here, no logo. This is the Walther logo, which every year, and even post-war guns, will have a logo. Post-war guns won't say Zella-Mehlis right here. It'll say Ulm, because Zella-Mehlis was destroyed, that factory was destroyed, and the Walther factory was rebuilt in the city of Ulm. So Zella-Mehlis banner, the Walther banner, Zella-Mehlis logo, is not on the 1945 guns. Now remember, PPKs, you won't find PPKs with no logo because they stopped production in 44. So we're up to 45, we have no logo, and instead, what do they do to identify the factory? AC. If Randy will throw up an AC, he's not going to throw up. Randy's going to put up a P38. And you know, if you have a P38, the ones made in the Walther factory were all AC marked. AC 41, 42, 43, 40. So they had the AC. And so what they did, again, they're saving time and money, and they used the AC and no logo. You can see this one, 1945, end of war. It has Eagle N. This one has no marking. By the way, if you pull the slide back, you'll find the Eagle N right here as well. Not sure I can get that very well. But right there is an Eagle N, and Eagle N here and here. So these guns, by the way, are an interesting study. So what we know is this was issued. Now, what was happening in 1945? Well, as I already said, the Allies were coming. The British and some French and the Americans were coming in from the West, and they were already in Germany, and the Russians were moving in on Berlin. So they were popping these things as fast as they could. This was actually issued to a military officer, and the way we know that, it is Waffen-proofed. And that's a Waffen 359, that's just the inspection stamp. So it's Eagle N, Waffen 359, stamped here. These are very rare, where they went ahead and took the time to stamp them and approve them for the military, and they were rushed to the front. This probably went to the Western Front because it was captured by a GI and brought home. Now compare and contrast, remember that's what we're doing, comparing and contrasting. Notice this has no firing proofs, which means it was never got its final inspection and was never test fired. Also, it's mismatched. And we call this a GI mismatch. This ends in 577P. This ends in 325P. Mismatch, they call them GI mismatch because the GIs came in at the end, and Randy actually, we have pictures, Randy will throw up here for us, of the GIs picking up these parts and putting them together. They didn't bother trying to match them up. Of course, the Germans, when they were putting them together, it was mostly forced labor. I believe it was 5,000 Polish workers were working in the Walther factory at the end. They did match it. They still were sending them to the front. They went to the Russian front and to the Western front. And some of them were captured in the Battle of Berlin. These, however, never left the factory. So these parts, and you can see from the serial number, it's just a little bit later. These parts were put together by GIs, or the other thing that happened is the GI for a pack of cigarettes would pay the Polish workers to put them together. Polish workers were happy to see the Americans, happy to help out, and they actually couldn't return to their own country because the war was still going on. They had to stay put until the war was over. So they wanted to work for food and cigarettes and whatever else they could get in trade, I'm sure money as well. So the GI put together gun with the wood grip, never issued, and then this one that was issued to the military, just probably this is January, February, and this is definitely April. The GIs took the factory in April of 1945. One other thing I wanted to show you, by the end of the war, they were experimenting with phosphate finish. We know that, for example, P-38s in the Walther factory had phosphate finishes to them, and they never made a phosphate slide and frame that I know of. You can see on this gun, this is not phosphate. I'm not sure about this, if it's phosphate or not. This is blued, this is phosphate. Now just a little bit later, remember this is just a month or two before, you can see this is phosphate, most likely this is phosphate, and this is blued. So there you have it. It's just, you know, they were experimenting with some phosphated parts. Again, cheaper and faster. And look at both of these magazines. You're going to see something interesting about the magazines. Bottoms are blued, and the tubes are phosphate. They're both phosphate tubes. And one other thing, and only in 1945, on the back, you see a W. That W means unhardened. So they didn't bother hardening the metal. It was an extra step, and it took time. And the Russians were right outside banging on the doors, actually in the Zella factory. The tanks were rolling up into the town. And so they were just throwing these out as quickly as they can. So you see unhardened PP, phosphate with blued bottoms. Now, you won't see a PPK. I have seen them. It looks like a PP that was cut off, but you generally won't see PPK with the W on it because they didn't make them in 45. Remember, they stopped in 44. So these are unique and desirable magazines to go with the gun. Speaking of magazines, all right, for no extra charge, I'm giving you a quick tutorial on the magazines for PPs and PPKs. Some people say, I'm looking at pictures, I want to buy this magazine, but I can't tell if it's a PP or PPK. You can, of course, tell in person because you just go like this, and you can see the PP has one extra round, room for one extra round, and that's how you can tell, by the way. A PPK is going to have 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 holes, 6 bullets fit in it. A PP, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You got 7. Now, the earliest ones, it would make sense, are Walther Banner, high polish finish. This is PP and PPK. This actually has the open follower. The real early guns, just the first 1,000 or so, has an open follower. This doesn't have the open follower, but the open follower just means it's open right here. It doesn't work as well. When you go to feed the bullet, sometimes this gets twisted and look, it doesn't work very well. So they didn't use the open follower very long. And by the way, if you collect Colts, the 1903, 1908 Colt has that same open follower, and I find it annoying. But here they corrected that. This is only among the first 100. Then they went to this slab side. There's a lot to learn here. We've got the slab side versus the indented side. But let's keep going with the magazines. We had high polish, banner only. Then during the war, so 1940, they started putting the caliber. So you have PP and the caliber. And then finally, we go to the very end of the war. You see the phosphate, caliber, and the W. So that's just a quick tutorial on the grips, the magazines, how you can learn a lot from just looking at these guns and comparing some of the manufacturing changes that happened toward the end of the war. Hey, I hope you liked my twins, and I hope you learned something today. These are probably already sold, but if you go to our website, you'll see some of our new inventory. Make sure you like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.